Most certainly, I tell you, there will not be left here one stone on another that will not be thrown down. A destruction so complete that Roman soldiers would literally dig up the foundation stones to scrape out the gold that had melted and run between them during the fire.
Yeah. It really remains one of the most vividly realized, geographically specific warnings in the ancient world.
And right there, that completely changes everything you think you know about this text.
Oh, absolutely.
Because you hear words like that with that kind of massive apocalyptic weight, and you instinctively assume, okay, it's about the end of the universe.
Right, the cosmic end of all things.
Exactly. But here is the biggest realization for you today. Matthew chapter 24, specifically the first half of it, isn't some abstract, mystical, end-of-the-world poetry.
No, it is not.
It is a gritty, incredibly precise, first-century survival manual. It's a tactical blueprint designed to keep Judean communities alive in a literal historical war zone.
And that is the crucial pivot we are making today in this deep dive. We are stepping completely out of modern theological assumptions.
Which is hard to do, honestly.
It is, but we're embarking on a strict academic historical analysis of verses 1 through 28 of this first-century Jewish apocalyptic text.
Yeah.
And to really understand what is happening on the page, we are viewing it entirely through the lens of Roman-era politics and, Jewish eschatological tradition.
Right, because it's a text that is deeply embedded in the mud and the blood of a very specific time and place.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's unpack this from the very beginning. I think we have to start with the physical setting because the geography of where this conversation takes place is it's carrying massive symbolic weight.
It really is doing a lot of heavy lifting.
Yeah, so Jesus and his disciples are standing outside the elaborate complex of the Jerusalem temple. And we aren't just talking about a local church here.
Oh, no.
This was the absolute center of the Jewish cosmos. It's an architectural marvel, right?
Yeah.
Massive white marble stones, gold plates everywhere.
Just stunning to look at.
And Jesus casually drops this crushing prophecy about every single stone being thrown down. Then they leave the city.
Right.
The actual conversation, the unpacking of this shocking statement, it happens privately, completely outside the city walls.
Yeah, they move eastward across the valley to the Mount of Olives.
Which is key.
Extremely key. If we look at the historical and literary precedents, the Mount of Olives was the traditional location from which Hebrew prophets surveyed Jerusalem to announce divine judgment on the city.
Wow.
So by situating the discourse there, the text is doing something very deliberate.
It's setting a very specific stage. I mean, when I think of the Mount of Olives in the context of judgment, my mind immediately goes back to the Hebrew Bible.
Yep.
Specifically, Ezekiel's vision of the divine glory literally departing the temple. In Ezekiel 11, the presence of God gets up and moves to this exact same hillside.
That is the exact lineage being invoked here. By sitting on that specific hill with his disciples to deliver a message about the temple's destruction.
Jesus is deliberately placing his discourse in the tradition of Old Testament prophetic literature.
Precisely. He is stepping into a deeply established prophetic role, signaling that a major covenantal shift is occurring.
So the setting is heavy with meaning. But here is where the psychological reality of the scene gets really interesting to me.
Oh, the expectations versus reality.
Exactly. There is this massive, almost painful gap between what the audience expected to hear and what they were actually told. The disciples enter this private conversation expecting a revelation about Israel's coming liberation.
They want the good news.
Right. They're looking for the transition to a glorious new era, the eviction of the Romans, the restoration of the kingdom.
They are completely anticipating triumph. I mean, their questions are essentially, when will this happen? What will signal this transition to power?
They want the golden age.
Exactly. They're looking for the dawn of a golden age.
And what they get instead is a countdown to absolute destruction. It's like showing up for a victory parade, fully expecting confetti and celebrations, and instead, someone hands you a blueprint for a bomb shelter and a list of rations.
That is a perfect analogy.
The contrast between their hope for a new era and the grim reality of the instructions they receive is just, it's razor sharp. It's not a victory speech, it's a survival checklist.
And the structure of the text reflects that grim reality. The section is organized as a countdown. It explicitly describes the deteriorating conditions that will precede the Roman siege of 66 to 70 AD.
Right.
We are talking about severe political deception from leaders claiming divine authority, wars between regional powers, famines, earthquakes, and intensifying persecution against this specific early Christian community.
But the text doesn't just leave them with a vague sense of dread, right? It gives these listeners a highly specific signal.
Yes, an alarm bell.
An alarm bell that tells them exactly when to abandon their homes and run for their lives. But to understand that signal, we have to look backward at a horrifying historical event involving an altar, a foreign king, and a sacrificed pig.
We do.
So what was this ultimate desecration, and how did it act as the ultimate warning system for a completely different century?
Well, to unlock that mystery, we have to look directly at Matthew 24, verses 15 and 16. Jesus says, "When, therefore, you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place,
Right.
then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains."
The abomination of desolation. I mean, it sounds like a title from a dark fantasy novel.
It really does sound traumatic to our ears.
But for the people listening, it had a very real, incredibly physical, and deeply traumatic historical meaning.
What's fascinating here is how apocalyptic literature recycles trauma. Jesus is pointing to a historical reference his audience would have known intimately. It's essentially a cultural scar.
Yeah.
In 167 BC, the Hellenistic ruler Antiochus V Epiphanes entered the Jerusalem temple.
And just to be completely precise with the historical record here, the text and historical context specifically point to Antiochus Epiphanes, not Antiochus V, right? Because Antiochus V was his son and an entirely different ruler.
That is a crucial distinction, yes.
Oh, wait.
It is Antiochus V Epiphanes. And when he goes into the temple, he doesn't just loot the treasury.
He erects an altar to the Greek god Zeus right there in the sacred space.
Exactly. And he sacrifices pigs on it.
Which, if you understand anything about Jewish purity laws and covenantal identity, this isn't just an insult, it is an existential threat.
Oh, absolutely.
It's a deliberate, calculated attempt to annihilate the core identity of the Judean people by defiling the absolute center of their religious and physical world.
It was the ultimate defilement. It was an act of cultural erasure, and it was the spark that triggered the massive Maccabean revolt.
Wow.
In the Maccabean literature, that specific event, the altar to Zeus, and the unclean sacrifice, was termed the abomination of desolation.
Okay, so by reusing that exact phrase from the prophet Daniel, Jesus is signaling to his audience that they need to watch for a comparable act of foreign desecration.
Yes.
He's essentially saying, remember that horrific world-ending thing that happened a couple of centuries ago? Look for the Roman equivalent.
Precisely the point.
Mm-hmm.
Early Christian communities interpreted this reuse of the phrase as pointing directly to the looming Roman military presence entering the sanctuary precincts during the Great Revolt of 66 to 70 AD.
Because the Romans brought their own symbols.
Exactly. The Roman legions carried standards bearing the image of the emperor and the Roman eagle, which they actually offered sacrifices to.
So to the Judean mind, the arrival of these idolatry symbols in the holy place was the new abomination.
That was their alarm bell.
And when that alarm bell rings, the instructions the text gives are incredibly practical, almost jarringly so. I mean, the text says, don't go back inside your house to get a coat.
Right.
Don't return to the field if you're working. Pray the crisis doesn't come in winter. And the instruction to flee to the mountains aligns perfectly with the physical mechanics of warfare and the geography of Judea.
Because of the terrain.
Exactly. If you are running from the Roman war machine, the coastal plains are a death trap. That's where Roman cavalry and infantry formations excel.
Oh, absolutely. They dominate flat ground.
But the hill country to the east, that terrain is rugged. It is full of caves. It provided shelter and hiding places where conventional Roman military tactics really struggled.
It is a profoundly grounded geographical strategy. It shows a clear understanding of asymmetrical survival in that specific topography.
But you know, I have to admit, I push back on this a bit when I read it.
How so?
Well, this is supposed to be this profound religious document, right? A cornerstone of spiritual literature. But in these verses, it feels so mundane, it feels panicked.
I see what you mean.
It reads less like Holy Scripture and more like an emergency broadcast alert you'd get on a modern cell phone today. Leave your belongings, flee immediately, do not return. It just feels completely devoid of theology in that moment.
But you see, the mundane nature of the instruction is exactly what gives so much historical weight. It is not distant theological speculation because the threat was not theoretical.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It reads as a document composed for people who needed to know the literal mechanics of surviving an impending slaughter. The panic you were picking up on that reflects the raw reality of Roman siege warfare.
Okay, so if you're listening to this and you're wondering about the stakes, what happens to the people who ignore the alarm bell?
It is not good.
Right, like if that text is the signal to escape to the mountains, what happens to those who stay behind in the city walls hoping for a miracle? And who tries to take advantage of that kind of societal collapse?
Matthew 24, verse 21, sets the stage for the horror that follows for those who stay. It says, "For then there will be great oppression, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, nor ever will be."
Unprecedented oppression. And from the historical sources we have, we know this wasn't just ancient hyperbole.
Not at all. It was a brutal, documented reality. We rely heavily on the accounts of the Jewish historian Josephus to understand the mechanics of this oppression.
And Josephus is a fascinating, if complicated, primary source, right? Because he actually defected to the Roman side in 67 AD under Vespasian.
He did. And because of that defection, he observed the final siege of Jerusalem from within the safety of the Roman camp.
So he literally had a front row seat to the destruction of his own capital. The psychological toll of that must have been immense. What does he actually record happening inside the walls?
He documents a truly grim reality that completely matches the apocalyptic tone of the text. He writes about mass starvation inside the city walls. It was so severe that the social fabric completely disintegrated.
Wow.
But the destruction wasn't just coming from the Romans outside. Josephus records intense internal Jewish factional violence.
Right, fighting each other.
Exactly.
Sure.
Different rebel groups were essentially destroying each other from the inside, burning their own cities' food supplies in power struggles, while the Roman legions simply waited them out.
That is horrifying.
And for those who tried to sneak out of the city to find food, Josephus documents mass crucifixions occurring daily outside the walls, designed by the Romans to break the psychological will of the defenders.
The environment inside that city must have been beyond desperate. And history tells us that desperation breeds exploitation. When a population is starving and their world is literally burning, their standard of evidence for a miracle drops to zero.
It really does. The political tension of 66 to 70 AD perfectly matches the warnings Jesus gives in verses 23 through 26.
About the false saviors.
Yes. The text explicitly warns against false rescuers appearing in wilderness locations or private rooms, promising deliverance. Jesus warned his followers, if anyone tells you, look, here's the one you're waiting for, do not believe it.
And Josephus documents these exact kinds of figures emerging from the chaos, right? Charismatic leaders stepping up and claiming divine authority to fix an unfixable situation.
He does. In his Antiquities, Josephus names a series of charismatic Jewish leaders who gathered large followings by promising political and spiritual deliverance from Roman rule.
Right.
He names Theudas, for instance, who led crowds to the Jordan River, promising that the waters would miraculously part for them, just as they had in the days of Joshua, signaling a new conquest.
But the Romans didn't care about historical reenactments. They saw a political threat.
Correct. The Roman governor, Cuspius Fadus, captured Theudas, slaughtered his followers, and had Theudas beheaded.
Brutal.
Then there was an unnamed figure Josephus calls the Egyptian prophet. This man led thousands of desperate people to the Mount of Olives, promising that at his command, the walls of Jerusalem would simply fall before them, allowing them to overpower the Roman garrison.
And I imagine the Roman response was equally brutal there.
Yes. The Roman governor Felix routed the Egyptian prophets movement with heavy infantry and killed many of his followers.
Unbelievable.
And even during the final revolt itself, Josephus names faction leaders like Simon Bar-Jorah and John of Kashala, who gathered followers inside the city through a mix of charisma, terror, and promises of divine intervention. The survival manual in Matthew maps perfectly onto this documented political landscape.
It's incredible how human nature doesn't change. I mean, if you're listening to this and thinking you'd never fall for a guy promising to part the Jordan River, remember that you aren't trapped behind a besieged wall, starving to death while an empire waits to execute you.
Context changes everything.
It really does. Context changes human gullibility. These charismatic leaders act like disaster opportunists. They prey on desperate people whose world is collapsing by promising miraculous, impossible fixes.
It is a recurring psychological pattern in human history. When complex systems collapse, people crave a simple savior.
Yeah. And the text also notes a fascinating detail in verse 14, that before the end of this era came, this message would be proclaimed across the empire.
Which is entirely consistent with the documented rapid spread of the early Christian mission in the decades leading up to 70 AD.
Hmm.
The movement was expanding across the Mediterranean just as the political situation in Judea was violently deteriorating.
So we have this intense, gritty survival manual. We have the warning about the alarm bell, the Roman standards in the holy place. We have the geographical instructions to run to the hills and the psychological warnings not to follow charismatic cult leaders into the desert. The big historical question is, did anyone actually use the manual? Did anyone listen?
We do have historical reporting on this outcome. The historian Eusebius records that Christian communities in Jerusalem actually heeded a comparable warning and withdrew to a city called Pella across the Jordan River before the final siege began.
Okay, so they saw the political signs, remembered the text, and they got out.
Well, we must exercise strict historical rigor here.
Of course.
I must emphasize that this account by Eusebius exists in a tradition disputed among modern scholars. Some scholars believe this tradition reflects historical reality and a successful evacuation, while others question its historical reliability, suggesting it might be a later theological construction.
Okay, so it's debated.
Exactly. But whether or not that specific coordinated escape to Pella happened exactly as recorded, the text itself undeniably functioned as a strict warning for that community to flee the looming violence.
It is a fascinating piece of the historical puzzle, whether it was a mass-coordinated evacuation or just individuals making a run for it. Now, there's one last piece of imagery in this chapter that we really need to decode because it completely changes how we read the text today.
It does.
After all the gritty, street-level survival advice, verse 27 shifts tone. It says, "For as the lightning flashes from the east and is seen even to the west, so will be the arrival of the figure prophesied in Daniel."
This specific verse is perhaps the most misunderstood part of the text for modern readers.
Because the moment we modern readers hear lightning flashes from the east and is seen even to the west, our minds immediately go to a weather event. We picture physical lightning illuminating the night sky like a massive atmospheric anomaly.
But the text gives us the interpretive key right there. It says, "So will be the arrival of the figure prophesied in Daniel." This is not a weather report. It is a direct, deliberate reference to Daniel chapter 7.
And if we look at Daniel 7, it isn't about meteorology. When I think of Daniel, I think of the lion's den. But chapter 7 is something entirely different. It's a cosmic courtroom scene, isn't it?
It is a profound throne room vision. In Daniel 7, the Ancient of Days is seated in judgment, and a representative of a persecuted people, the Son of Man figure, ascends before the divine court to receive authority, glory, and sovereign power.
So it's a scene of ultimate vindication.
Yes, it represents a scene of political transfer of power on a cosmic scale. It is absolutely not a literal meteorological event. The lightning in Matthew 24 is a metaphor.
Okay.
It describes the sudden, undeniable, and universally visible nature of this vindication. It's an image of ultimate authority being granted to a suffering community, visible to everyone, just as lightning is visible to everyone.
And this is such a massive trap for modern readers. It is so easy for us today, sitting in the 21st century, to misread ancient political metaphors like lightning flashing across the sky as literal, almost sci-fi events.
Right, like special effects.
Exactly. We read it like it's a special effects scene in a blockbuster movie. But that's only because we've lost the historical context of Daniel 7. We've forgotten how first-century Jewish audiences used apocalyptic language, the language of shaking heavens and falling stars and lightning, to describe earthly political realities and the overthrow of empires.
If we fail to understand that metaphor, we completely miss the point of the text. The point is about vindication. It is a promise to a community that is currently being crushed by the Roman war machine.
Yeah.
The promise is that their suffering is not the end of the story, and that their representative will ultimately be granted true authority over the very empires that are currently destroying their city.
It is an incredible shift in perspective to go from a prophecy of total architectural destruction down to a frantic, hyper-practical set of survival instructions about not grabbing your coat, and ending with this deeply political, cosmic metaphor for ultimate vindication.
It grounds the text in the intense realities of the first century, rather than leaving it as a vague prediction about the end of this space-time continuum.
And that is exactly why we love digging into these historical sources. It leaves you wondering. We look back at the first century and see how easily people confused political destruction with the literal end of the physical universe.
Hmm.
It makes you wonder what modern political, social, or ecological crises we might be misinterpreting right now through our own modern apocalyptic lenses. Are we looking for the end of the world when we should just be looking at shifting power dynamics?
It is a profound question about how human beings process immense historical change.
Now, we want to turn this over to you. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on this incredible first century historical drama. Hearing these intense physical survival instructions, would you have known to run to the eastern hills? Or do you think, in the terror of a siege, you would have been tempted to stay behind or maybe follow one of those charismatic leaders promising a miracle? Let us know what you think.
We always appreciate your insights into the human elements of these ancient texts.
And if you enjoyed today's deep dive into the historical realities of Matthew 24, please make sure to like and subscribe so you never miss an analysis. Also, do not forget to check the description below for exclusive links and more resources to keep exploring this historical context with us.
The layers of history here are just vast.
Absolutely. Now, we've reached the end of this specific survival countdown, but what happens when the dust actually settles from the fallen temple? In the text that immediately follows this manual, the narrative shifts entirely from earthly destruction to the ultimate arrival of that Daniel 7 figure we just discussed. How does this massive cosmic political transfer of power actually unfold for a community whose world has just been torn down stone by stone? We'll dive into that next time.